Welcome to the WCAPS 5 podcast series. WCAPS is an online community dedicated to strengthening the leadership and professional development of women of color, specializing in the fields of peace, security, conflict transformation, and foreign policy. Join us as we unpack their valuable perspectives, learn from their strategies, and grow together. VIVE: Vision, Impact, Voice, Engagement.
Hello, this is Ambassador Jenkins. I want to welcome all of you to another one of the WCAPS Vive podcasts. And I'm really happy to be here with my colleague, Nabila Jamshed. And she will correct me if I did not say her name exactly right, and I'm hoping that I did. She was really nice to do a webinar with us a few months ago on chemical security and non-proliferation issues. And it was such a great webinar that I really wanted just to have a little more time with her because, you know, the other webinar we did have 3 amazing women. And I'm looking forward to being able to speak with Nabila now one-on-one and to share a little bit more of her background with you. She's been doing some really great work and working now with the UN. And I just want to make sure that you have a chance to hear about her and what she's done in her career. So welcome, Nabila. Thanks for taking time to be with us today.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much, Ambassador Jenkins. You almost got my name exactly right.
Okay.
It's Jamshed, but
okay.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be here, and I can't wait to get started.
Great, thank you. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you working now, and what are some of the things that you're working on?
So as you very rightly said, I'm currently with the United Nations, and I've been with the UN system, the family of organizations, for a number of years now, ever since I got out of university. Where I studied global governance and diplomacy, and I specialized in peacekeeping. So I've got the privilege of having worked with a number of different parts of the UN system since then, over the last 6 or 7 years. So currently I'm with the Office of the United Nations Resident Coordinator in India, which is the coordinating agency for the United Nations at the field level, at the country level. And a lot of our job is I work as a public policy specialist, so a lot of our job is to link sort of the government with the coordination and the work of the United Nations agencies in a country the size of India. It's a very exciting country to work in because India is one of the largest peacetime operations of the UN anywhere. And the work is very oriented towards the day-to-day development issues. There isn't a lot of crisis sort of context here. But in my previous jobs, I've had the privilege of working with the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in South Sudan, which was my previous assignment, where I worked with the Analysis Center as an information analyst and reporting officer. I've also worked with the Chemical Weapons Treaty Organization, the OPCW in The Hague, before that. And then a couple of UN agencies. So a lot of this work has been around policy, speech writing, external relations, sort of program management. And so I've got to see the UN and especially the work in peace and security that the UN does from a lot of different perspectives. So that's what I've been up to the last few years.
Wow, that's quite a bit of amazing stuff. We could spend an hour on each one of those. So where are you from, and tell us a little bit about how you got interested in these policy issues that you're working on now.
Oh, it was quite simple. I'm from India. I was born here, and I went to school here. So I've been here for a while, and I've been in and out in my working career. So I've been in South Sudan, as I said, in the Netherlands. I studied in the UK, but then I sort of have been in and out of India with all my UN assignments as well, especially New Delhi, which is kind of my hometown. I got interested in the issues of peace and security, I think, by first being interested in the question of war, as weird as that sounds. But a lot of this, the way that the Westphalian system interacts with each other, high school onwards, the way that we've organized ourselves into countries and communities, and at a political level, the way that the entire map of the world has changed in different ways, has always been of deep interest to me. So I knew I wanted to study politics. I knew I wanted to get into the motivations and the questions behind why communities and nations and countries go to war against each other, the rise and fall of empire. And the more you sort of grow into that field of knowledge, you realize that the valuable contribution you're going to make in policy in these areas is going to be in the peacekeeping realm. So, you need to sort of orient and divert your knowledge towards, just sort of use that experience, use that knowledge to try to end situations of crises between these communities and nations that you've been so interested in studying. And as I said right off the bat, when I got in college, I had an opportunity to do internships and work with nonprofits, including the Asian Development Bank, which is a very sort of an intergovernmental organization. And that is where I think I was fairly certain that I wanted to be in the UN system, in the multilateral realm, because that's where my interest was in trying to explore more of these issues. And I was lucky enough to sort of land positions with the OPCW and the UN right out of university when I was in the job market. So, and then working in all these different organizations have just demonstrated to me the different ways in which we come together as countries to create policy. And I'm, in a very sort of optimistic way, very excited about the opportunities we have, even though the time that we live in right now is not very benign to multilateralism, but it is the motivating sort of, it is the motivation behind a lot of what I do and how I engage with my work.
So what would you say led to your feelings of optimism? And I asked that question because I think that people who work for the government, who work in multilateral organizations, who work in these public service policy, technically policy related work, have a sense of optimism about what we can be, recognizing that we have problems, but by working together, that's kind of what the UN is all about for me, working together to make the world better. Where do you think that came from in your background?
I think it was, and I'm going to say something which is slightly different from, you would expect that optimism comes from having a sense of idealism or having a sense of moral direction, that this is where you want to see things go. But I think a lot of my optimism, considering that my academic background was about really delving into the technocracy of the United Nations and sort of the technocratic nature of multilateral decision making, of international law and policy making, a lot of my optimism about the direction in which we can go was fairly logical, because I didn't see it so much as a function of this is what we morally should be responsible for as a world, these are the issues, and this is how we must come together. I don't think there's, although of course there is value in cooperation, but I don't think that inherently the push towards cooperation is an ethical one. For me, it was more about in the post-globalization world, we were just so interconnected as countries that we began to have a common language, a common understanding of certain things that cut across boundaries of the Westphalian state that began to seem artificial. I feel like the volume of trade, the volume of interactions, the sheer complexity of the internet, just the way the world has evolved, it is so interconnected across a range of issues. And then, of course, we were increasingly confronted by challenges and problems, both in international peace and security as well as in development, that seemed to be completely new and that didn't belong to a particular country. So whether that was climate change, whether it was the refugee crisis, whether it was civil war spilling across the borders of a country into another, the challenges and opportunities of migration, whatever the motivation for that are. And I felt like there was a logical conclusion to sort of being a world that was able to handle these challenges efficiently, and that was to be cooperative, to come together with a head start in these multilateral systems, whether that was the United Nations, whether that was a new form, sort of newfound United Nations 2.0, whatever that looks like, not to say that what we call multilateralism today is perfect, but I think there are opportunities to strengthen those relationships, to sort of rebuild the social contract on the basis of which we would be able to build a world that is just better equipped and fit for purpose to deal with these fundamentally global and multinational challenges that we have today.
And that sounds great. And the reason why I like so much of what you said is, I think a lot of what I talk about is similar, about global security and the challenges of global security and the connections amongst some of these challenges. And I think you know trying to help others understand that. And what I like about what you said is the recognition, the understanding of all of that, and having that very strategic view about the way in which these forces interconnect and relate to each other, and that we need to find a better way to work together to resolve some of these kind of global challenges. So that makes a lot of sense, and that, to me, that's another reason why you work at places like the UN or other multilateral organizations, because you want to find a way to do these things all jointly and working together. And so you've mentioned a lot of really interesting places that you worked in organizations, working in South Sudan and in OPCW, for example, and where you are now. So how did you manage those types of transitions? And I ask that because I know a lot of young people come to me and ask me, how did you go from this to that to that? And you've mentioned that you started early, when you finished school, you kind of knew where you wanted to go and you went there. How did you do that for younger people who want to know, what do I do? How do I be like Nabila? How do I do what she did?
That's I'm not sure if, young people want to be like me, but I'm going to answer the question about transitions, which it's also, I feel like I'm still as a stage in my career that I think about these things. I wonder if I'm headed in the right direction. But what has worked for me in a surprising way that I didn't think would was making the shift between a lot of different kinds of work in organizations. A lot of people will tell young people getting especially into the field of international peace and security, or getting into the very broad sector agnostic area of multilateralism, that you need to be a specialist straight away, and you need to pick your area of specialization, and that has to be very, very narrow, and you have to do it early. But when you actually get into the technocratic side of implementing multilateralism on the ground, which is through organizations of the UN and treaty bodies, you realize that a lot of the work that you're doing needs transferable skills. For me personally, that was what kept me going. I found it, of course, it's challenging. I'm not saying it isn't without its sort of disadvantages and without its own particular challenges. But at the same time, whether the entire area of international cooperation, of being able to get countries together or implement an international mandate in a challenging security environment or in a challenging developmental context, requires a certain set of skills that can be transferred, say, whether you're working in the UN development program, in a field office somewhere in Asia, whether you're working in a peacekeeping mission in East Africa, or whether you're working a headquarters job in The Hague, which is greatly diplomatic. A lot of your work is going to involve being able to listen to a lot of different kinds of stakeholders and develop solutions that respond to everybody's needs. So it's kind of like, if I could use an example from the private sector, it's kind of like, let's say it's like being a management consultant. They work on a lot of different areas, but it's easy to make that transition. And I wish that, someone had told me this when I was young. So I think through the podcast, I'm also going to reach out to young people and tell them, I don't think, especially at this age, when you're in your 20s and your early 30s, I don't think you should back away from trying a lot of different kinds of things. The transitions are challenging, but they're completely worth it. I went from disarmament to peacekeeping. I could have stayed in disarmament for longer, but I decided to do the peacekeeping stint. And from peacekeeping, I went to development because the opportunity was that great. And I haven't regretted it, because even in the development sector now, the invaluable lessons that I learned from being in the field during an active conflict zone and being able to sort of write crisis reports for headquarters while there was active gunfire raging outside and tanks were firing at us, always holds you in good stead, no matter what you do. So I would say that the transitions are challenging, but they're absolutely interesting and worth it. So I would just reach out to everyone and say you should make them. Just take the leap. Wherever the biggest opportunity for you is, you should go there.
Right. And what would you say? I mean, you're, like you said, you're still early in your career, making looking at where you want to go and what you want to do. But in the interesting jobs that you've had in the past, I mean, what would you say would be some of the best aspects of what you've done in those jobs?
Oh, there are so many to choose from. As I said, I was extremely privileged just to have these opportunities. And the two sort of big highlight moments for me so far that I do want to talk about, and both of them just happen to be just a coincidental function of being in the right place at the wrong time, actually, because the two offices that I worked with in quick succession, the OPCW in The Hague and the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, were confronted by some of their biggest crises at a time when I happened to be working there. With the OPCW, I started working at a time when the organization, so the Chemical Weapons Convention was signed in the early 90s. I think it came into effect in 1993, if I'm not wrong. And they'd never confronted in the life of the organization an actual event of chemical weapons being used in conflict. They'd never had to confront that before. So it was a preparatory organization, an absolutely excellent one that was disarming under international verification countries that had got together 190 states in a commitment to disarm and their chemical weapon arsenals under, with the verification of international inspectors. It was really an example, an exemplar of how multilateralism can do disarmament. But the actual situation of someone having used chemical weapons somewhere was something we were confronted with in 2013 when I was working there. And we got news of chemical weapons having been used in Syria, in a suburb near Damascus. They said sarin had been used and a number of people had died. And then just to be able to deal with that just to be able to be in a situation where you saw information coming in and then you had to, in the real world, this was not a simulation anymore, deal with what information has to be taken into account, what certain diplomats are saying about it, how the first political statement needs to be drafted, how it needs to go out, how the next political statement will be drafted. And then when I returned to the organization in 2015, we were confronting the implications of the disarmament of Syria that had just taken place on international waters through a joint UN and OPCW joint mission. And that was an absolutely fascinating, interesting time to be there, just to see policy in action. And the second, of course, is when I went to the UN mission in South Sudan, a peace agreement had been signed and it was about to take effect between the government and the rebel leaders. And then in Juba, which was my duty station, the capital, when the returning army of the rebels, they sort of came back to the capital, and we thought that the peace agreement would be sort of taking off now. The rebel leader is going to become the vice president. Mr. Riek Machar was returning. Mr. Salva Kiir was happy to open up the government for him. And then, of course, the two sides started shooting at each other, and it erupted into their sort of second civil war in the history of the organization. The mission was under direct fire. It got caught between the attack on both sides. And so a lot of my analytical work, I was working there as a reporting officer. So I had to basically develop mission leadership briefs and situation reports, weekly and daily situation reports, analyzing the security on the ground, gathering sort of intelligence from different parts of the mission, and then putting them into a narrative about what was happening. And to be able to do that in an active conflict zone for weeks when all of this was happening was something completely different from what I've done before. And I can only hope in hindsight that my work made a difference. I hope that I was able to tell that story. I hope I was able to translate that information in the right way to make to affect to make a contribution to what the UN was trying to do and what the international community was trying to do. So again, a very significant time to be there, and I'm very thankful to have both opportunities, really.
Yeah, so say a little bit more about your time in South Sudan. Tell us a little bit about what that was like.
So I, like I said, I joined the organization, the peacekeeping mission, right out of The Hague. I applied for a position with the analysis center there. And this was at a time when peace had just sort of started taking off. There was a peace agreement in place. So a lot of my work at that time was about reporting on the war that was actually raging across the country, but it hadn't really sort of all accumulated together into what you could call a civil conflict. So you had a lot of cattle rustling, you had sort of ethnic conflict raging across the country. And my job there, working off, so the UN is organized in a peacekeeping mission in a very sort of joint and closely knit way. So you have a peacekeeping mission. Everyone lives on the peacekeeping base. So we sort of like, we're living with the troops who are actually the blue berets, the peacekeepers on the ground. The mission leadership is all living together. We have a joint operations coordination center, which takes sort of the information that we provide from the analysis center and conveys it to force headquarters. So there was a lot of that coordination work, really all of us getting together, trying to understand what the narrative was here, whether the peace would hold, what were the little strategic issues that would come up, not just in terms of making sure the transition from war to peace happened successfully, but also to make sure, for example, that humanitarian convoys were being given adequate protection when they went to deliver important life-saving aid to different parts of the country. And that the human rights work and the civil affairs work all came together. So it was a really, the analysis center was a good place to be in because we got to routinely engage with all the different parts of the mission, and then develop all the stories and all of the intelligence that they had from the ground into these intelligence reports and these, properly laid out narratives that the mission could act on. It is a difficult duty station to be in. It's a non-family duty station of the UN. Of course, it sounds a little facetious every time you talk about, your work as a peacekeeper or a humanitarian or an aid worker being challenging, because you're working in a situation which is so challenging, and where the people that you're working for are so on the edge of survival on so many different counts. I mean, it feels kind of, whenever I try to talk about the difficulties of the duty station, I run into the challenge of actually saying it was challenging for me, because I actually lived on a base where, I knew that if things got very bad, I would be evacuated quite safely by the international community, by the UN. It was actually the war raging on everybody else that was much worse. So I won't say much about the challenges of actually being there. But then, and then the war broke out in the capital city when the peace agreement seemed like it was being it was all coming together. And the vice president designate's army had moved into Juba. We were at work when we first heard on our radios that firing had started in the middle of the city, and then we started hearing firing near our base, because the base is actually located near Jebel Mountain, where the rebels bases are. So they were right next to us. And then we were basically crawling on our knees across in our houses, sleeping in the bathroom, sitting under our desks and writing situation reports for the next couple of weeks. We would get into work in the morning when, during the ceasefire hours were late at night. So we would try to get into work very early in the morning before they started shooting again. There were situations when tanks were positioned outside our building and they were shooting at a target near us, not directly at us, but, which kind of were quite frightening. And then to be able to do useful work there in that situation, trying to put together an analytical report that tried to explain what was happening. I saw people who had a much more challenging job than myself. I at least was in the office, even though we were being fired at, but we had analysts who were actually in the field, in the protection camps, with the humanitarian convoys who were sending us information from, really in an unprotected capacity. And so it was just, it was one of the things I don't think I'll ever forget about. It was really invaluable in every sense.
Wow, what a great experience. And I was curious, how many other women were there with you during the Sudan experience?
There were women in quite strategic roles in the office that I worked in, which I was quite pleasantly surprised to see, because I know the statistics about UN peacekeeping. And, with the troops and everything combined, I think the percentage of women is not very high. I'm not sure what it is, so I don't want to put out a number, but it's actually quite, it's nowhere near gender parity when it comes to United Nations peacekeeping missions. And it's difficult, especially with the nation states contributing troops, because a lot of the troops that are sent are, male-only contingents and battalions. So, but there were women in strategic positions. There were women in the analysis center. There were women in the military from different countries in the operations that we did, that I had the privilege of working with the head of the mission, the special representative of the Secretary General, was a woman during my time there. So the kind of the mission leadership, the directives coming were also from women. And it was so important for me to be able to see all of them at different stages of their career, at different ages, being able to do this, because you also confronted, I think, as a young woman, with whether this is going to be challenging, where the glass ceilings are, what are the stereotypes, the challenges that you might have to confront if you got into a field that was so male dominated, and their example was so important during my work there.
Well, I mean, that's really amazing to hear about the number of women who were there. And so I guess since there were people from different countries, so there was a lot of different ethnic backgrounds of the people who were working with you and from these countries, I assume, as well.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, so oddly enough, and I'm from a college in New Delhi. I studied for my bachelor's degree in a college called LSR, Lady Shri Ram College, which is one of the more, it's one of the better colleges in India. It's well known. And I go into the peacekeeping mission, and one of the only sort of Indian women I met there is also from that college. And then we were just, we're quite happy, because those are the places that we end up meeting people from LSR. But no, there was, I was so surprised to see a number of Indian women. So there was, in the police force, in the medical unit, and there were women from the different African countries that had, that were politically engaged in the peacekeeping mission. So there was a wide range of ethnicities. I mean, I think there was I wouldn't say it was dominated by any particular kind of country or cultural background. There was a group of women that were from practically every part of the world. And that could just be a matter of the fact that I worked in the analysis center, which is kind of combines the military and technical expertise of all the different countries and brings them together. But it was good to see women of color, women of different kinds of ethnicities and backgrounds working together to problem solve at that strategic level.
Wow. And is that, in some of your past positions at OPCW and elsewhere, I mean, have you also felt that there were an unusual number of women than what one would normally assume, for example, at your time at OPCW and where you are now?
I think so I would say at the OPCW, again, a lot of formidable women that I had the privilege of working with. The deputy director general of the organization when I was there was a woman. In general, but I will say that in the international organizations that I've worked in, and with peacekeeping as well, the fact that I say that there were these outstanding women that I had the privilege of working with is not to negate the fact that the gender balance in the organization is not great. I mean, we haven't reached gender parity in, and especially when it comes to strategic positions in practically any organization yet. The Secretary General of the UN has been pushing for it, and gender parity was one of his first things that he did when he took office. And he was able to accomplish that in the cabinet, and now is trying to push for it, in leadership levels. For example, resident coordinators need to be 50% women. But the reason that he had to do that when he took office was because organizations don't have a great gender balance. So, while I'm able to say that the top leadership was female and some of the most badass women that I worked with were female, you could also see that a lot of sort of the leadership of many of the branches and offices within the organization, or for example, the more conventionally male-dominated stereotypical areas like a purely military sort of department or a purely technical scientific department, there happen to be even fewer women. And so I would say that's definitely still a problem everywhere, even though you get to meet remarkable women, and things are, the organization is making its best efforts to change this.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned some of this already, but what would you say is the biggest challenge? Is it because you're talking about an international, in whether you're talking about the OPCW or the UN, you're dealing with with institutions where people from different countries or countries themselves may be very male dominated in different spaces related to these issues. And they may be more dominated in the phase, or more dominated in some of the technical areas. I mean, I presume that's part of the challenge, but I don't know if you had any other thoughts about that.
That's definitely part of the challenge. I mean, this has been said ad nauseum by everybody. So I wouldn't be making a new point here, but many parts of our structures just weren't designed for women. And I don't mean that by saying that there's a different capability that women have. I just mean that any organization is a reflection of the larger world we live in, where a lot of our structures just haven't accommodated women very well. I mean, I was just reading the other day, I think less than 7% of the world's leaders, heads of government, are currently women. And I think that any office, any organization that you work in is kind of a micro reflection of that. And although there are legal sort of, HR policies are in place, and there's a lot of encouragement and calls for women to apply, there are obviously these inbuilt prejudices, as you also rightly said. I mean, there could be fields where women generally aren't there. For example, if you have troops that are coming in from a country, India has been one of the countries that sent an all-women contingent to Liberia, for example, recently. And you could already see how important that was, because the UN mission in Liberia actually issued a statement thanking the police contingent from India, and said that it inspired an increase in Liberian women becoming police officers. They said there was a fourfold increase in Liberian girls and women who said they wanted to be police officers and actually enrolled themselves into police academy and wanted to join the police. And they said they were directly inspired by the experience of seeing women. And I'm going to add, they didn't say this, but I'm going to add to this probably also women of color, women who were like them, Indian women who were, sort of police officers, came into the country and did valuable work in addressing sexual and gender-based violence, in addressing the actual crisis, the ongoing conflict and bloodshed, and helped humanitarian convoys, got the peace agreement together. And so it's so there's also that the mental blocks of the different structures that we have that stand in the way, that need to be demolished at every level. It's the patriarchy has deep roots.
And a couple more questions, and before I do let you go, and you did mention the topic of women of color. I mean, where you are now and where you are at the OPCW. I mean, what any thoughts about that in terms of where things are now and some of the challenges, and how that can be, how we can increase those voices, and you rightfully noted the impact that something like that has on young girls who, as I always say, they need to see people who look like themselves. And you made that point. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about some of the challenges for, women of color, and, how fortunate it is that you're there, and you could be a role model for other young girls. And so I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, you're absolutely right in every count. And I think that this is action that needs to be taken at every level. I think it's great that it started from the absolute top, the Secretary General himself pushing for gender parity at all levels in the UN. And it absolutely can't just be, I don't think it's as simple as saying we need to change mindsets, and we should be careful of, falling into the trap of saying this is just about mindsets, and it's just about cultural stereotypes, and it's just about inspiring women to join these organizations in this field of work. I think a lot of that also has to do with actively breaking down the legal institutional barriers, the structural violence inherent for women to join this. That's at two levels. One is obviously, a place like the headquarters in a Geneva or a Vienna or a New York for an organization is a different kind of challenge, because then you need to sort of get the technical experts, get women from, who have that technical expertise to come and contribute to this field, to start thinking about international peace and security as a place where they can make a difference, even if, and in very important ways sometimes, not just contribute to more of the same, but actively change things. So for example, if you're a woman, for example, me being in a peacekeeping mission, If I find, that for me to find that women in the mission are pushing for sexual violence to be taken seriously as a security concern when they're in a meeting talking about security issues in a way that probably, I don't want to say probably wouldn't be there if it was an all male sort of team, but I think women have made an important contribution in pushing for sexual and gender-based violence as a security problem, to sort of securitize that question. And then, of course, so there's the sort of headquarter level of interventions where we need to do more sort of, policy work, more legal HR frameworks, pushing for that kind of change, inspiring women, connecting them, building networks like WCAPS that bring women together to learn from each other, to be able to see other women of color, playing that role, to see yourself there in a way that, you haven't seen yourself before, because it's always been white men. And on the other level, I think at the field level. So if you're talking about, a peacekeeping mission in an African or an Asian country, or a small developmental office and where there are developmental challenges, to be able to give agency to the people for whom the work is being done. I mean, it's not just about someone coming from the outside. That needs to be an active part of the developmental and of the peace building work that you're doing. I mean, there is no sustainable peace and there is no sustainable development at the ground level in a peacekeeping mission or a developmental agency in a country like India or Bangladesh or anywhere else, without actually making women their partners in the future society that you're trying to build. And so that is a whole different level of intervention. That's about, getting women's voices to participate in decision making for the first time ever in some cases, and then sort of, getting them to play that active role through legal changes, through cultural changes, institutional changes, through rights-based legislation, giving them economic opportunities, pushing them towards empowerment. There's a lot of different levels of this, but a lot needs to be done.
Right. And I'm wondering if, as one last question for you, and you touched on it a couple times about, young girls and lessons and, if what would be your, in a room of young women and young girls who want to learn and from your choices and, how can what you've done help them think about how they can get into these fields? What would you say to them?
I would say, okay, I'm going to actually, if I may, there is something, I know a lot of UN speeches are just, more of the same, but I feel like with the current Secretary General, there are some very hard-hitting things that he routinely says. And one of them, as I was reading about his sort of push for gender parity, there was a phrase that he used that really sticks with me, and that's something that I would like to say to young women through this medium. He said, we must push back against the pushback. And I think today in a lot of our, our field of work, for people like you and me, and for the members of WCAPS and women who are part of this larger sort of informal network of people who are working in international peace and security, some of our challenges are also to do with, getting into fields which are male dominated, but then the challenges that come with them are not just limited to people judging you on the basis of your gender or your color and, second guessing your abilities, but it's also about the sort of the structural violence, the structural prejudice that comes with, whether your voice will be heard, whether your voice is important. Just because you're not a man who comes from a military background, do you have anything useful to say for peace and security? I think it's important for women to push back against the pushback that they're being confronted with, because yes, you may not have a male military background and you may not see security questions in the same way, but you have a technical expertise in the field that you're coming from. You should be confident about that, be authoritative about what you're saying, never feel like because you don't belong to the stereotype of what an agent in international peace and security looks like, that your word isn't absolutely or even more valuable than what they're saying. Because maybe, coming from a slightly different background as a woman, maybe you didn't get into the military, maybe you're coming from a PhD in, international diplomacy, you've studied hard to understand the way in which conflict and development work, you have something more important to say than all of the men in the room. And I think you should say it very loudly and say it again and again till people are ready to hear.
Great final words. So great. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Nabila. I really, I think it's really enlightening, and it's great to hear about your experiences and your transitions. And, you've been in some really interesting positions at interesting times, which I'm sure has shaped you in very, very productive ways. So, we look forward to you continuing to provide advice and continuing to be the role model that you are to young people. So thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you thinking of me for the podcast, and I have had a great time speaking with you.
Thank you. And so we'll be back again with another podcast very soon with another one of our amazing women from WCAPS. And until next time, thank you for listening.
Thank you for tuning in. To keep up to date with all things WCAPS, visit us at wcaps.org or join us at an event in a city near you. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at WCAPSnet. Until next time, speak up, speak out, get engaged.